George had one of the great right hands of all time.
Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the heavyweight champion of the world, Big George
Many know George Foreman from his iconic loss to Muhammad Ali, or from his stellar salesmanship of a certain grill. But when the name Foreman is spoken, the image that should enter into everyone's mind is that of the most terrifying knockout artist to ever live. An unstoppable behemoth lumbering forward, so incredibly powerful just a touch could send men flying across the ring. A man so brutal, yet so savvy that he could take back his championship at the age of 45, 20 years after losing it. In a sport where most athletes age like milk left out in the Texas sun, George Foreman seemed to age like a fine bottle of wine. But regardless of which era you fought him in, his 89% KO rate meant you were probably getting flattened like a sheet of paper. It's one of the most surprising and innovative transformations in boxing history. After a decades-long break, Foreman added the rare, bordering on mythical, crossguard and other know-how into his old-school repertoire. A big reason he was able to capture the world title in two distinct eras. By the way, let me know in the comments who you think would have won if he'd faced Tyson. Today, we're going to look at two breakdowns in one video, locking down the iconic styles and tactics of young George Foreman and seasoned George Foreman. Big George took up boxing at 17 and quickly became a top amateur, winning multiple tournaments and eventually earning a place in the Olympics. After taking the gold medal, Foreman's self-professed proudest moment, he turned pro in 1969. Storming the professional ranks with furious, fight-ending ferocity, cutting down most of his opponents within a few rounds, using ingenious tactics that were last in vogue 70 years earlier. Young George Foreman, unlike the jovial man we know today, was an imposing figure and a nightmare scenario for most heavyweights standing across from him, subjected to his icy stare. It was his highlight reel knockouts that grabbed the headline, but it was his unusual old-school defense that set up these terrifying knockouts. Foreman implied what's known as a long guard as his primary defense, hence why Muhammad Ali dubbed him the Mummy. With his guard loose, he was very effective. With his arms extended, he could control his opponents, pushing and prodding them, smothering their offense, trapping them in their own guard. Like a wrestler, Foreman would look for points of contact, trying to touch his opponent's head, shoulders, arms, or gloves. Once he touched them, he had control. Some of these skills he actually learned from a judo practitioner, and the pairing of grappling and power blows worked perfectly for the big man. All of these tactics helped him set up his shots, either by nullifying their offense so he was safe to rattle off punches, or stifling their guard, as if you were trying to hold a door shut. Pinning the arm meant the opponent couldn't counter with it, or use it to help defend their other side. Or by shoving them off balance, bullying them into positions where you could better line up his shots, like pushing a pedestrian into oncoming traffic. Foreman didn't just expertly cut off the ring, he bulldozed competitors into the ropes. You never knew if a punch or a push was coming, but either one would pin you into the corner. Using the long guard, a guard far more common in Muay Thai, was a big gamble, but when the cards were down, Foreman always had the intuition to bet on the right hand. That wasn't the only way that his defense conveniently helped his offense. His looser guard made his punches highly unpredictable, because they could come from anywhere rather than one consistent guard position. Even worse for competitors, Foreman's punches looped like curveballs, and it only took one strike from Big George before they were out. The way he threw punches was actually what had most concerned Ali about fighting Foreman. It was hard to anticipate what punch was heading your way because it would morph into a different strike with a new target midway through. But even with his hands down, Foreman had no fear of his opponent's big haymakers. He would simply extend his arms to long block, taking the inside track to derail their shots until they ran out of steam. Then it was his turn. This was made all the easier if he had already established that point of contact. Or he would have his hands so in their face that he could stop the punches just as they were getting started. It goes without saying, this must have been a frustrating, blinding experience for Foreman's competitors. Even the keenest opposition had trouble seeing through leather. If opponents managed to get through all of these defenses, then Foreman was surprisingly agile for such a big man. His footwork and head movement was his last line of defense, and it must have felt demoralizing to suddenly get through this awkward, lumbering fighter's insane guard and realize that he was actually fast as lightning when he wanted to be. It's funny, but fascinating to see him dance around the ring during this exhibition fight, where he took on 5 men in one night. Ali was in the crowd, and I can't help but thinking he was taunting him, or at least saying, "You think this is hard? I could do this too." But maybe the greatest weapon in Foreman's arsenal was his jab. Forged and refined by his time sparring boxing champion Sonny Liston, a master of the heavy jab. Liston, a man with hands the size of most men's biceps, loved to set up his power shots by pounding the opponent with battering ram leads. But the greatest trick to Liston's jab that Foreman adopted was leaving it out there to lean his weight on his opponents. The true definition of a heavy jab. Another overpowered tactic he maybe picked up from Liston was to use the jab to bait head movement. He could trick them into moving their heads directly into his next punch. And this would not be a jab. A fantastic example of this is his title-winning effort against Joe Frazier, where Foreman jabbed to take advantage of Frazier's tendency to duck, then made him pay with a stout uppercut. Foreman went 40-0, defending the title multiple times before his historic defeat by Muhammad Ali. A major setback that meant he'd need to work hard to get back to the belt. But after a loss to Jimmy Young and a post-fight near-death experience in 1977, Foreman retired to become a minister. And for most athletes, that would be it. But not Foreman. To the shock of boxing pundits and the public at large, Big George Foreman mounted a comeback in 1987. After a decade away from the ring, most expected a diminished version of the hulking 70s heavyweight. Instead, they got George Foreman 2.0, more of a well-rounded elder statesman, thanks to an honest assessment of his remaining strengths and new weaknesses. Like an old kung fu master who can dodge a million blows by barely moving, anticipating every attack before it's thrown, Foreman proved that experience can sometimes make up for athleticism. Besides, he still had his power, and more importantly, his mind. He also brought back the legendary Archie Moore, a man with 134 knockouts. Just like Liston, Foreman became an incredible student and mastered Moore's signature crossguard style. George was smart enough to know he couldn't defeat Father Time, but by remaking his style, he could outlast and outsmart his much younger competition. While age had taken away some of Foreman's speed and reflexes, he still had his strength, and the crossguard allowed him to tank through damage. One of the most dangerous moments for a boxer is right after they punch, before they can pull their hand back to their guard. This may have been a big problem for Foreman since he had slowed with age, but the crossguard system allowed him to turn his punch right into a cross block. Getting rid of that vulnerable moment in time by closing the defensive gap immediately. Foreman's brother Roy, a trainer himself, noticed that George had always had trouble with defending right hands after he jabbed. George's crossguard helped with this, as well as a high elbow block. Plus, throwing up twin cross blocks created a quick, low-effort shield that would deflect the majority of his opponent's shots. It was a catch-all strategy that was guaranteed to at least partially negate most punches, while conserving his stamina for his offense. This way, Foreman didn't need the reflexive parries and head movement of his youth, or the ability to follow his opponent's lateral movement and keep aligned with them. He was safe in his fortress until he was ready to fire off the cannons. But this was only the simplest strategy. The crossguard is not foolproof, as Foreman proves here by immediately targeting the openings in his opponent's crossguard. But Big George still had his old tricks to help him out. When it came to the crossguard and his older tactics, it wasn't an either-or situation. He was excellent at melding the long guard and the crossguard into a system. He would use his long guard to establish contact, then collapse into his crossguard as he pressed in. This resulted in the potential for complete control as he moved through every range. Conversely, he could use his old grappling tactics from his crossguard, repositioning opponents by cross-framing, once again setting them up for punches. Foreman could bully from long range with his long guard. In fact, this resulted in one of the strangest knockdowns ever. George long blocked a hook, then looked to turn it into a frame. But the force of the punch knocked Foreman's palm into his opponent's temple, sending him toppling to the canvas. While in close range, Foreman could bully equally well with his crossguard, using very similar tactics to Roberto Duran to clear space for punches. Here Foreman uses a cross trap to make way for a rear hook. Here Foreman pulls down his opponent's guard to hook, then pins it to set up another hook. And since Foreman loved body shots, this was just one more way for him to grill and batter his opponent's ribs. You can check out my book Aggressive Defense for even more crossguard and long guard tactics and how to combine them. Foreman's offense also got an upgrade. Replacing explosiveness with his veteran savvy, he became even craftier with his power punches, mixing signature haymakers with far more compact power shots, explaining that going wide, then tightening up the shots confused his competitors to no end. It was a natural way to deviate the tempo and angles of his combinations. So opponents had to worry about defending varying rhythms, angles, impact, and multiple targets against one of the hardest punchers in history, knowing that if they lost, it was to a man decades older than them. It could not have been a fun experience. But it had little to do with them, and more about how rare and exceptional a fighter George Foreman is. Foreman still remains the oldest heavyweight champion of all time, and the biggest lesson his achievement can teach us is one of balance. Big George believed in himself even when others didn't. But he was not so overconfident that he believed himself the same fighter with the same physical attributes he had enjoyed as a young man, only because his ambition was paired with acceptance of his new limitations, because he was able to introspect and go into deep study, working hard to learn new skills, capitalizing on his new strengths while limiting his old. Could he make his impossible dream a reality? And in so doing, become an inspiration for generations to come.
It had been 2 years since Joe Frazier had won a hard-fought decision against Muhammad Ali. Frazier had defended his championship twice after fighting Ali, and Ali had defeated 9 straight competitors. All of the world was demanding a rematch. Frazier intended that to happen, but first, he set his sights on the #1 contender. George Foreman was a 4-1 underdog coming into the fight, and Frazier expected him to be a mere stepping stone on his path to a rematch with Muhammad Ali. But George Foreman would be anything but easy. By the time Foreman fought Frazier, he had racked up 37 victories in just 3 years. Most of them ended by knockout in the first few rounds. It was already becoming apparent that Foreman had possibly the greatest punching power of any boxer, or perhaps any fighter, in history. But Foreman swung wide and seemed to lack technique. As such, Frazier was expected to teach him a lesson in real boxing. The night came, and the two men met in the middle of the ring. Frazier rocked back and forth, but Foreman stood stock still, staring Frazier down, looking eerily calm. Not a trace of fear in his eyes. The two men rushed forward. Foreman threw first. His wide hook backed Frazier up immediately, something it had taken Muhammad Ali 9 rounds to do. Frazier bounced right back into the center of the ring and leaped into his signature lead hook. The punch was partially blocked, but it was on target, and now it was Foreman's turn to back up. But before Frazier could follow up, Foreman framed off of his shoulder to maintain distance. Frazier pursued, and this time Foreman used both hands to block his entry. Undeterred, Frazier pressed in again, attempting to get inside Foreman's reach. And yet again, Foreman stopped his advance, this time pulling Frazier down as he stepped away. Frustrated, Frazier tried to punch his way in, stepping in deep with the hard right. But Foreman smoothly parried his punch, and turned Frazier as he pivoted away at 90 degrees, like a matador escaping a bull. Frazier, the man who could pressure anybody, couldn't even touch Foreman, and was being thrown around the ring like a child. This was partially due to Foreman's size, but Frazier had humbled many giants before. This was the heavyweight division, after all. The problem was that by focusing only on Foreman's punching power, Frazier, and the rest of the world, had entirely overlooked the rest of Foreman's skill set. What was happening, essentially, was a clash of styles. Frazier was an aggressive pressure fighter. Rather than use the traditional footwork for cutting off the ring, Frazier instead came right at his opponents, relying on his erratic head movement to make them miss, and ducking in under their punches to catch them with his powerful leaping hook. When Frazier got into close range, he wore down his competitors with constant wrestling and body shots. Nobody had been able to keep Frazier at bay for long. But Foreman's defense was something Frazier had never seen. Foreman relied on a number of old boxing techniques that had mostly fallen out of favor by the time he began to make a name for himself. Rather than use head movement or shell behind a tight guard, Foreman would stop his opponent's punches before they began by pushing at their arms, shoulders, or gloves. He would employ leverage guards, shooting his arms out not to strike, but to block incoming punches. He would pin and pull at his opponent's arms when they got close, disturbing their balance. And for such a big man, Foreman had highly underrated lateral movement, using his fast feet to create new angles of attack and come in from the side. When his opponents pressed him, he would stiff-arm them to keep distance, pushing them down and steering himself away. All of these techniques allowed for Foreman to dictate his position and keep his well-balanced, upright posture. This was the other half of Foreman's style, and it allowed him the ability to set up and land wide, powerful swings that his opponents would have otherwise been able to easily evade. And Frazier's style left him especially susceptible to these techniques. His low crouch let Foreman easily frame off his back and shoulders and push him down. The way he charged straight in allowed Foreman to sidestep him easily and pin Foreman's lead arm before he had a chance to throw his hook. And Frazier's preference for wide, looping punches meant that Foreman could reliably intercept them with linear, straight-arm blocks. Once Foreman had established his defense, he became more aggressive. Foreman caught Frazier with his first uppercut, and missed with his second. Frazier responded with the lead hook, and tried to move in, but Foreman pinned his arms, and then pushed him away. The fight was now becoming more competitive. Foreman's punches were sailing harmlessly over Joe's head, but at the same time, Frazier was getting outmaneuvered every time he tried to get into his preferred range. But the stalemate ended when Foreman caught Frazier, first driving a hard uppercut into Frazier's crossguard off of his jab, and then timing him as he came up to land a tight lead hook. Frazier moved in, ate another jab, weaved under a cross, and moved with the lead hook before leaping into his own. Foreman blocked it, but then Frazier charged in. Rather than re-establish distance, Foreman held his position and threw. Frazier drove his head into his chest and landed a hard body shot. He'd just proven that, given time, he may be able to get into close range, where he could wear Foreman down. But then, Foreman landed a single jab. A jab from Foreman was all it took to stagger and to unbalance Frazier, a man who had taken a barrage of hard rights from Muhammad Ali. From this point on, Foreman's jab would frustrate Frazier just as much as Foreman's grappling techniques. Frazier was used to taking a few grazing shots as he came in, but usually he more than paid it back when he got inside. But now, the ability to close distance had been taken away from Frazier, and he could only bob and weave at mid-range safely for so long. and Foreman was able to track Frazier's head movement partially through touch, pinning his hand to Frazier's head and driving him right into his power shots. At this point, Foreman had lost all respect for him, and he was getting away with just pushing Frazier back to the center of the ring. Foreman's jabs began to land at will. Frazier was still able to avoid most of Foreman's more powerful follow-up punches, but his senses were dulled, and he was losing his timing. Most fighters would have circled, jabbed, tried to clear their head, but it wasn't in Frazier to fight defensively, and besides, Frazier found safety on the inside. He stood his ground, bobbing and weaving, trying to find a way forward. But then, Foreman landed one more hard jab. Frazier's head snapped back. He stood his ground, dipped down, and ran right into George Foreman's uppercut. Frazier went down. This was against anyone's expectations. This was Joe Frazier. But now, he fell to the canvas in round 1. The announcer uttered the now iconic words, "Down goes Frazier! Down goes Frazier!" Joe got back up. He took his count, and he came back ready to fight. But Foreman sensed victory. The title was right in front of him. All he had to do was take it. Both men came out swinging, Foreman eager to claim victory, and Frazier desperate to stay in the fight. At first, neither man landed anything really significant. Foreman swung wide, putting everything he had into his punches. But Frazier's tight boxing forced him to pay better attention. Foreman narrowly avoided getting caught several times by Frazier's hooks, which still had fight-stopping power behind them. Foreman refocused, and Frazier's head movement saved him from multiple knockout punches. It's crazy to think that any one of the blows Frazier narrowly ducked under would have sent most ordinary men to the hospital, if not the morgue. Joe was surviving, but he was backing up, and eventually, another of Foreman's jabs caught Frazier, and he felt his back bounce against the ropes. Throughout Foreman's barrage, Frazier continued to fight back, ignoring the punches that hit him to load up on his own. Foreman stood at length, entirely composed, as the punches that had sent multiple contenders crashing to the ground sailed by mere inches away. Foreman's jab was making the difference now, keeping Frazier just far enough away to avoid his punches. Even Foreman's jab contained an element of guard manipulation to it. He used it to paw and tear Frazier's guard down repeatedly to make way for heavier punches. Frazier was getting punished and rapidly losing ground. From Foreman's corner, the great Archie Moore yelled, "Underneath!" Foreman took the advice. Again, it was an uppercut that brought Joe Frazier down. Frazier got up, wobbling, trying to regain his footing. There was only a few seconds left in the round. Again, Frazier did not try to circle or buy time to recover. Again, Frazier charged into Foreman. And again, he fell. Frazier did make the count, and the bell rung. He had 1 minute to recover. Frazier would come out to fight for the second round, but he was dazed and badly hurt. So at this point, it's not worth mentioning the technical aspects of such a one-sided fight. But there is one thing to take note of, and that is how many times Joe Frazier got back up off of the canvas to keep coming at George Foreman as if he'd been winning the fight the entire time. After the third knockdown of the second round, and the sixth of the entire fight, the referee finally called a TKO for George Foreman. When the fight was stopped, Frazier, dazed and wobbling, was still willing to fight. Even Muhammad Ali's trainer had been screaming from the crowd for the fight to end, scared that the champion would die in the ring. Foreman had reached the pinnacle of his career, what every heavyweight aspired to be. He was the new champion of the world. He seemed unstoppable. Frazier, for his part, would now go on to rematch Ali. But the circumstances had changed drastically. And this time, they would not be fighting each other for the championship. They would be fighting for a chance to fight George Foreman. and take the belt back.
In 1974, the world prepared for what would turn out to be the most infamous fight of all time. Big George Foreman, the hardest hitter in boxing history, had taken the championship from Joe Frazier the year before in a decisive fashion. And the iconic Muhammad Ali had avenged his losses to Frazier and Norton in two tremendous clashes of skill and perseverance. Now there was only one fight the fans wanted to see, and they were going to get more than they ever expected. The two warriors soon jumped on a phone call to finalize the $10 million deal, split evenly down the middle. The fight was agreed to be held in Zaire, Africa, and billed as the Rumble in the Jungle. Ironically, the two confident gladiators both thought they heard fear and hesitation in the other's voice, surely ensuring an easy victory. But their iron wills and unshakable confidence were pretty much all the two had in common at that time. Each boxer could not have been more different in temperament or style. Foreman was a wrecking machine, an unstoppable Goliath who had raged through the heavyweight landscape, laying waste with earth-shattering punches and thoroughly crushing all those foolish enough to stand before him. He boasted 40 fights and 40 victories, 37 of them by knockout. But it was not the bone-rattling concussive force of his blows alone that had won him those fisted conquests. Foreman had a refined jab and nuanced wrestling, skills passed on to him from sparring the fearsome Sonny Liston. Rather than rely purely on sheer force to smash through his opponent's barricades, he used long guard tactics to prod and pull at their defenses. This had prompted Ali to christen Foreman the Big Mummy, but while Foreman had the same kind of relentless inevitability as a horror monster, he was anything but clumsy or uncoordinated. The big man had highly underrated head movement and footwork, and would even use subtle hand traps to remove his opponent's guard, a trick he had picked up years before from a judo practitioner. And this was the man that Ali had pissed off, less from any taunting or teasing, and more because many fans still saw Ali as the rightful champion. Muhammad Ali was perhaps the most graceful boxer to ever enter the ring, although he would surely give that honor to his hero, Sugar Ray Robinson. Ali had certainly adopted his idol's unorthodox footwork and whip-like jab, breaking nearly every rule of boxing and reverse engineering it to fit his particular unique preferences. Ali would cross his feet, pull his head far behind his base of support, and slip far to his weak side. Despite all this, or maybe because of it, he had completely destroyed some of the most fearsome boxers of his era. But the question remained, what would happen if and when Foreman took away all of these tools? Ali was now 33, and his legs weren't what they once were. So what would happen when Ali was cornered and forced to contend with the fearsome haymakers of the young, strong, Big George Foreman? The night arrived. It was 4 a.m. in Africa, the bout scheduled to air during primetime in the US. Despite this, the heat was sweltering, the fervent crowd only adding to it, the harsh lights sizzling and turning the arena bright as daylight. Foreman would be several minutes late to the ring. Before each fight, his trainer would wind him up with an emphatic stream of curses as he viciously described how Foreman would destroy his unlucky competitor. When he finally let Foreman loose, he felt like a monster that could explode his opponents with one punch. But this suited Ali fine, who now had time to get a feel for the ring, testing out the canvas and the ropes, and most importantly, familiarizing himself with the crowd, who he considered a vital partner in the ring, capable of asserting pressure and sending good vibrations. Big George arrived, ready to silence his detractors and claim the title he already owned. He had not let a fight go past 3 rounds in 5 years. He had trampled over Norton and Frazier, who Ali had struggled with, so why should tonight be any different? Already Ali was taunting him as they met to receive their instructions in the middle of the ring, saying, "Chump, you're gonna get beat tonight. You never should have come to Africa. Your title is gone." The bell sounded. Instead of dancing, Ali charged forward to taunt Foreman, then leaped right back. But Foreman didn't take the bait, and Ali's swift would-be counters hit nothing but air. Foreman would stick to the plan his trainers had carefully devised for him. He methodically stalked the fleet-footed ex-champion. But all the power puncher got for his patient discipline was a lead right to the chin. Foreman's preference for crowding opponents at mid-range, combined with Ali's speed and tricky rhythm, made leading rights possible. But Foreman didn't mind, so long as he was closing the distance. He swung for the fences each time Ali got near the ropes. Ali controlled his head to imbalance him and throw his punches off course. As he so often did, Ali was flipping the script here, using grappling tactics against the man who had outmuscled many great champions to set up high-impact KOs. Feeling that Foreman had been overhyped, Ali teased him, proclaiming that it was halfway through the round and he hadn't landed anything yet. But then, Foreman landed something. He nailed Ali to the ropes with his lead hand and hammered at his head and sides. Ali pushed the stalwart heavyweight back with effort, but was trapped again only a moment later, Foreman pounding thudding haymakers into his sides. It was then that Ali first took a full impact shot from the formidable young champion. This punch George's camp referred to as the anywhere shot, because George would load it up from below his hip and just throw it as hard as he could, not really caring where it landed. Ali was shaken. He fled the ropes and kept moving. But now Foreman had his rhythm down, and Ali was horrified to realize that he could not escape. Foreman was taking 2 steps to Ali's 6, moving diagonally to cut off exit routes and expertly placing his left foot in between Ali's feet. Ali's only choices were to go toe-to-toe or retreat to a corner. Then, the bell sounded the end of the first round of the Rumble. As Ali walked back to his corner, he finally understood how Norton and Frazier had fallen with so little resistance. George Foreman was a monster. Ali knew he needed a new plan, but right then, he had no idea what it could possibly be. Ali tried to entice Foreman into committing again at the start of round 2, but George one-upped him, feinting to back Ali up without risking a real attack. He once more easily cornered Ali, but when he started pawing to destroy his guard, he found the ex-champion had no guard. Ali instead punched through and around Foreman's probing gloves, parrying and framing to create better positions. But after all that, it was a simple 1-2 that got the job done for Big George. This was the terror of George Foreman. Opponents never knew if his gloves were glue or dynamite from one moment to the next. Ali shelled up, focusing on survival, waiting for the tuning fork in his head to stop vibrating. He felt half awake and half in a dream, but he had been there before and was prepared. The awake part told the dream part, "We must not get hit again." Fortunately for Ali, Foreman suddenly changed tactics, whirling tremendous body hooks into his sides. Anyone who's seen footage of Foreman targeting the heavy bag has to wonder at Ali's insane conditioning to take those shots. Head cleared, Ali went back to hand-fighting Foreman, relying on his superior speed to aim around the big man's arm, shouting at the fearsome champion as he unloaded. The second came to a close. The round had been as heated as any in heavyweight history, with both men scoring insane power blows. But there were few watching that would think Foreman wasn't getting the better of that deal. This time, Ali's opening trick almost worked, but Foreman parried his punch out of the way just in time. Ali had heard that the plan in the Foreman camp was to knock Ali out in 3, and given the new fervor and urgency of Foreman's attacks, this very well may have been the case. Foreman was staying at a significantly longer range, rarely barreling in with wild punches. Ali couldn't control his head as well this way, and Foreman could better use the trapping tactics he was so fond of, clearing Ali's guard to make way for his punch, sometimes with the very same hand. When Ali tried to shell up, Foreman had a choice of targeting his body with wide-looping shots, or tearing down his guard by grabbing his forearm. And so, to Ali, the third felt like the longest round of his life. However, as his head began to clear and George began to slow, Ali came back to life, and he exclaimed and bragged with each shot, yelling, "Where's your punch? Show me something." The ref repeatedly warned Ali to stay quiet, but everyone had said Foreman would kill Ali in 3. The way he figured, if they expected him to stay quiet on the night of his death, they were sadly mistaken. The final ding may as well have been a funeral bell for George's ambitions. The fight would not be ending early. As George sat down, he felt as if he had already gone 15 full rounds, but there were 12 left to go. In round 4, Ali broke with his tradition and slowly retreated to the ropes, setting a steady pace only to break it with whiplashing jabs and crosses. Ali's punches stiffened the heavyweight giant repeatedly. Before he could react, Foreman found himself yanked off balance and smothered. Embraced by a man who shouted insults into his ear. But the greatest blow to Foreman this round did not come from his talkative opponent. At some point, Foreman looked into the crowd to see a man he had considered a close friend for years, rooting for Ali. We'll never know who, as he refuses to remember his name, but it was all the young Foreman could think of most of the 4th. Nonetheless, he managed an impressive piece of work near the end of the round, throwing a lead hook to the body, then changing angles to send another piercing straight through Ali's guard. But that was all to come of it. In between rounds, Ali's corner begged him to stay off the ropes, but Muhammad rarely listened to his corner. He felt he knew what he was doing. In Foreman's corner, his coaches spurred him forward, telling him to keep pouring it on. Foreman listened wholeheartedly, figuring it was his team's job to give advice, and his job to take it. In round 5, Foreman made an important adjustment, answering Ali's grappling with a cross frame or collar tie of his own. This way, the bigger man could trap Ali and pull him into his fearsome right hand. That was when Ali changed history in the most unexpected of ways. He took up a post on the ropes, leaned back, and shelled up. Foreman pounded hard shots into his midsection, and Ali dared him to hit him even harder. George didn't need to be asked twice. He hurled thunderous haymakers with all the fury of a god of war laying waste to a defiant nation. However, as with his footwork and head movement, Ali was using his high guard to showcase some of the most unconventional tactics ever seen in the ring. While the majority of boxers keep their arms in tight, moving them only slightly so as to create as few openings as possible, Ali was flaring out his elbows, using a movement pattern similar to a karate upwards block to diffuse the massive power of Foreman's blows. While this would normally leave Ali too open to combinations, Foreman's loaded, looping roundhouses were too slow for him to take advantage. Ironically, this was similar to a tactic of the crossguard style used by Archie Moore, one of Ali's former teachers, and a coach of Foreman for this very fight. The greatest would also shoot his arms out straight, leverage blocking to dispel the force of the blow. His only common tactic was to parry and block straight shots. For years, Ali had practiced taking his sparring partner's hardest shots in the gym while up against the ropes, much to the annoyance of his coach. Now, he felt he could judge how many punches any man could throw before getting tired. And more importantly, take the shots up to that point. Suddenly, with less than a minute left in the round, Ali came to life, smashing straights into Foreman's dome. Big George seemed completely unconcerned with Ali's power, walking through his shots to step out and angle in an uppercut. But a cutting jab snapped Foreman's head back, and as he ducked away, Ali chopped down on the Goliath's jaw, then used a jab to lance him forward, hurling a tremendous right just as George was trying to unleash his own uppercut. Foreman finally took a step back, gave a small nod of acknowledgement, then jumped right back in. Yet his head hadn't cleared, and Ali easily faded back from his unsteady attempts at a frame, unleashing his most powerful punch of the fight to turn Foreman's head clear around. Foreman never broke rhythm, as if Ali's punches were of absolutely no consequence. He finished by launching into a straight-arm left hook. Muhammad used the lax ropes to lean back and lock up George's head, sticking his tongue out in sheer defiance of the most dangerous punch in boxing history. The bell announced the end of the round, and the crowd rose to their feet. What had looked to many like a one-sided massacre had suddenly changed into one of the most epic exchanges in boxing history, with Foreman getting the worst of it. However, it remained to be seen if Ali could somehow repeat this miraculous feat. So far, the two had thrown hundreds of punches, all in 90-degree weather with 90% humidity. But somehow, Foreman came steaming out of his corner at the start of round 6. Ali met him there, crashing into him, pulling him close and yelling in his ear. In fact, in round 6, Ali's one and only goal seemed to be to piss George Foreman off. The Louisville Lip taunted Foreman every chance he got. He would throw a few shots, tie Foreman up, shout into his ear, and then repeat the process all over again. It was a bizarre spectacle in a heavyweight championship bout. Few suspected there was a method to Ali's madness. In round 7, Ali actually walked himself to the ropes, to the bewilderment of many. But Foreman's shots seemed to be mere echoes of what they once were. Ali was able to slip away out the side when the slow champion tried to capture him in a corner. But even now, Foreman was dangerous. He managed to pull Ali into a tremendous uppercut, loaded up from below his knee. The shot may well have dropped Ali if Foreman had landed it back when he was fresh. Another blow connected nearly by accident, as a tired Foreman tripped over his own foot while throwing a punch. The unexpected rhythm took Ali by surprise, but Foreman's unsteady frame crashed through the ropes, leaving him unable to follow up. As the 7th neared its end, Ali clinched his nemesis tightly and made his feelings clear, saying, "You got 8 more rounds to go. 8 more rounds, and look how tired you are." But in actuality, the uppercut had greatly troubled Ali. Back in his corner, he wondered to himself how much longer he could stand up under Foreman's relentless barrage. But in Ali's mind, no matter what the price was, be it a broken jaw, a smashed nose, he would gladly pay it to once again become king of the heavyweights. He figured you could play it careful only until you meet a man who will die before he lets you win. Then you have to lay it all on the line or back down and be damned forever. Ali could sense that test was about to come. The bell tolled, for who remained to be seen. Foreman's punches came wilder than ever. He seemed to leap into every lead hook. Ali pulled far back against the ropes, letting the punches sail by, terrifyingly close. The bee showed his stinger, small snaps that nonetheless bounced Foreman's head back. Still, Foreman chased, never easing up. Deep into the round, Foreman plunged forward and got stuck against the ropes. Ali cross-framed to send a looping right over his shoulder. Now Foreman was cornered, Ali angling out and sniping his jaw with short, tight rights. George tried to regain his poise, but Ali sensed the moment was here to risk it all. A long straight left hook, thrown from underneath, lifted Foreman's chin, and Ali replaced it with one of the most powerful rights he had ever thrown. Big George's legs gave way, and he seemed to fall slow motion, Ali turning with him, fist cocked. But he didn't need to throw it. The heavyweight giant had fallen, sent tumbling to the canvas, where he would just miss the count. Ali had shaken the world yet again. Foreman would forever believe he lost the bout due to treachery on behalf of one of his trainers. But he too would shake up the world when he regained the heavyweight title 20 years later. However, that's a story for another time. And 1 year after he had been dethroned at the Rumble in the Jungle, George Foreman was still reeling from his infamous loss to Muhammad Ali. To explain what had happened, Foreman had blamed the ref for counting too quickly. He had supposed his water may have been drugged, and he was livid that the ropes had been set so loose as to allow Ali to lean back out of the way of his punches. But nobody seemed to be listening. In Foreman's own words, he had become depressed beyond recognition, feeling that he had lost what defined him as a man. So, Foreman arranged a comeback fight with Ron Lyle, hoping to prove to the world that he was still the unstoppable Goliath he had once been. But Lyle was no easy opponent. Lyle had learned to box in prison as a youth, while serving time for killing a rival gangster. His sentence ended early after the governor pardoned him for saving the life of a prison guard who was being held hostage. Now a free man, Lyle turned pro at the age of 30, quickly gaining a reputation as a powerful brawler who could hang with the best competition in heavyweight. But as willing as Lyle was to trade blows toe-to-toe, he was also incredibly well-rounded, with one of the most eclectic arsenals of his era. He could employ long guard tactics and hand fight to set up power shots, just like Foreman. But he could also bend at the waist rather than the knees, like Frazier. This gave him extra reach for body shots, and loaded the shots he threw when he came up from ducking with more power. And believe it or not, he even used a crossguard from time to time. Having so many defensive resources, you may assume that Lyle had a weak chin or pillows for fists. But Lyle had taken Ernie Shaver's best punches, and then knocked Shavers out. What this meant was that when Foreman met Lyle in the ring, the crowd was most likely in for one of the wildest fights ever seen. The round started off with a bang, Lyle lunging in with a huge body shot. Foreman circled away, but Lyle wasn't done making his point. He squared right up to Foreman, hand-fighting with him at mid-range and throwing huge power shots. Although he remained calm on the surface, Foreman was legitimately shocked that Lyle seemed neither scared nor intimidated. But Foreman stuck to the plan, attempting to set up power blows off of his jab. He landed a beautiful lead hook, but not much else. Lyle's plan seemed to be to duck into hard body hooks, but Foreman was able to keep him away, most of the time by controlling his shoulders and arms. But both men were not exactly known for their patience in the ring, and the two eventually entered into a heated exchange. Astonishingly, neither man landed a clean shot. But then, all those body shots that Lyle had thrown throughout the round finally paid off. Instead of going low, Lyle went high. It was a hard shot, and Lyle tried to follow up, but Foreman managed to smother most of his shots, even landing an uppercut set up off a collar tie in retaliation. Still, Lyle was able to bully Foreman around the ring until the bell sounded the end of the round. If Foreman hoped to prove to the world that he was still a fighter to be feared, not merely respected, but feared, Foreman would have to put on a much more impressive performance, starting in the next round. Lyle was even more aggressive in the second, attempting to build on his success from the first. But Foreman did an excellent job circling away and turning Lyle, walking him right into hard shots. Then again, Foreman didn't really throw any other kind, and this was on full display when Foreman landed a huge uppercut, angling inside to counter Lyle's wide rear hook. Now Lyle was shaken, so Foreman upped the aggression to 11, but he had learned his lesson from his fight with Ali. He took his time, setting up his shots off of probing jabs.
He also did a great job mixing up his shots to keep Lyle guessing, alternating between overhands and rear hooks. But Lyle put his nuanced guard to good use, rolling with the punches to diffuse much of their power. Still, it might have ended in the second, but luckily for us, and tragically for Foreman, the round ended a minute early due to a timing error. Lyle would have ample time to recover. Both men had now had a big round, each hurting the other badly, but this was only a taste of what was to come. For all of his patience in the second, Foreman went into the third like a raging bull. He seemed willing to take a number of shots in the hopes of landing one big one. And Foreman did take a number of shots, many of which would have knocked out most other heavyweights. But to Foreman's credit, this ridiculous strategy may have actually worked on most other fighters. But Lyle's chin must have been made out of the same indestructible material as Foreman's. But one way or another, Foreman's strategy would force a conclusion. The fourth would be one of the most intense rounds of all time. Early in the fourth, Lyle rolled Foreman's rushed swings, parried his jab, and then expertly timed a beautiful 1-2 in response. Foreman's adamantium chin was cracking, and Lyle knew it. He chipped away again with a beautiful left hook, right uppercut, left hook combination. Foreman tried to back away, but Lyle showcased great lateral movement, cutting off the ring to land a right hook, left hook combo from southpaw. Lyle hit Foreman so hard, he didn't even feel any pain from the punch. He simply fell to the canvas. Foreman realized then and there that there were no more excuses to give. No loose ropes, no drugged water, nothing to blame but Lyle's mule kick of a right hand. But now, Foreman decided that this time would be different. He rose up to his feet without hesitation, not even waiting to see if his head had cleared. Foreman managed to survive, wisely tying up Lyle until he had recovered, and only then did he go back on the offensive. But Lyle was understandably reluctant to give ground after landing a devastating knockdown, and the two began throwing their hardest shots at the exact same time. It's important to note that neither Foreman nor Lyle abandoned their defenses entirely while throwing, as Foreman had done in the third. Both men relied on instincts built over years of training to know when to block and dodge as they threw. But this was still insanely risky for both men. It could only continue for so long until someone went down. It was Lyle who landed first, catching Foreman by tracking his head movement as he tried to slip inside. But Foreman threw a lead hook right back as if nothing had happened. Both men had only partially connected with their left, so both loaded up for a tremendous right. This time, Foreman slipped deep enough offline to dodge the punch and tagged Lyle. But now it was Lyle's turn to act as if nothing had happened, and both men again threw a simultaneous left, which Foreman slipped and Lyle pulled. Put in purely technical terms, both men had run out of to give. They were ready to end this now. Just then, Foreman bit on a right-hand feint, ducking low inside. This gave Lyle all the time he needed to set up his left. It connected, but Foreman ate it and continued throwing, hurling an earth-shattering hook into Lyle's jaw. Lyle tried to fight back through the haze, but Foreman landed again, and again, and again, and now it was Lyle who toppled to the canvas. Astonishingly, Lyle got up. Foreman again tried to finish with tact, using his jab and pulling down Lyle's guard to create openings. But Lyle did a great job rolling and deflecting Foreman's punches, so Foreman tried angling off to the side to set up new lines of attack. And while this earned him several successful hooks landed in a row, somehow, Lyle was still standing. So, perhaps frustrated, Foreman threw wider and wider. It was then that Lyle decided it was time to fight back. Foreman threw again, but Lyle's tighter hook connected first. So Foreman tried again,
and again Lyle intercepted the long punch with the shorter one. For the second time in the round, just when it seemed he was on the brink of victory, Foreman went down. Sitting on the canvas, Foreman thought back to that night in Zaire. He had wondered every day since, if I had given my all, then why didn't I die there? If I'd done everything I could have, why didn't Muhammad Ali have to kill me to beat me? Didn't you vow that you would die before you got counted out again? Foreman willed himself to his feet, and the bell signaled the end of the round. For Big George Foreman, the entire trajectory of the rest of his life would be decided in the next round. Lyle came on strong, battering Foreman with sharp, shearing punches. Foreman pushed him back to mid-range, and unloaded some of the most savage blows he had landed so far. But Lyle would not be deterred. A huge uppercut crossed underneath Foreman's jab and almost sent him back to the canvas, but Foreman managed to stumble back into his stance. Lyle hit Foreman with punishing combinations, but Foreman never stopped fighting. Circling, wrestling, jabbing, keeping up constant pressure. Both men were so far past their limit, it seemed impossible they were still standing, but Foreman was driven forward by the ghosts that had followed him since Zaire. Hitting shot after shot, Foreman finally connected with a stunning right that turned Lyle's already unsteady legs into rubber. He backed Lyle up on the ropes, then to the corner. For nearly half a minute, Foreman did not stop throwing. His punches got weaker and weaker, but so did Lyle, who seemed to slouch to the canvas, almost in slow motion. The ref counted, but Lyle stayed down. As the ref raised Foreman's hand in victory, Big George felt he had been redeemed, but not because he had won. To quote the man himself, "I was wrong about needing to win the championship again. Having proven that I could get off the mat, the core that made me a whole man reappeared." I've never gotten personal in any of my videos, but I will say, as someone who's going through a crisis right now, working on this breakdown and seeing Foreman's will to keep fighting inspires me to keep fighting, no matter how tough it gets. 20 years after his infamous loss to Ali, Foreman did the unthinkable. At 45 years of age, Foreman took his title back, shocking the world and leaving little doubt about Foreman's place as one of the greatest fighters in history. The magnitude of this accomplishment cannot be understated. Foreman had pulled off perhaps the greatest upset in boxing, defying convention and embarrassing a multitude of prominent sports writers. How Foreman pulled this off, and the path he took to get there, are both equally astounding. Foreman's early career had been full of nothing but easy victories, until it wasn't. But it was the difficult path that Foreman had tread, the one that had turned from endless triumph to loss and failure, that gave the ex-champ the experience he needed to pull off the impossible. The Foreman that took back his title was a completely different man from the Foreman who had lost it 20 years earlier. To understand how Foreman took back his title at 45 years of age, we must first look at how Foreman used to fight, back when he was a young up-and-coming boxer in his prime. After winning the Olympics, Foreman arrived on the scene of professional boxing like an atomic bomb. He destroyed nearly everyone who had the misfortune to share the ring with him, usually within the first few rounds. He did this by using his natural size and strength to pile on relentless pressure. Funnily enough, half of the pressure was purely defensive. While unfairly known as a rough brawler who simply used power to overwhelm his opponents, Foreman was in fact an incredibly intelligent fighter, using a number of old-school defensive techniques to control the ring. Primarily, Foreman used frames, stops, and leverage blocks to stay safe and destroy his opponent's balance. In this clip, Foreman leverage blocks, straightening his arm to intercept his opponent's punch. A variation of this technique is called a stop. Here Foreman stops his opponent's punch by clamping down before he even has the chance to start throwing it. Foreman used these stops, leverage blocks, and even jabs to frame against his opponent's head and shoulders.
his outlocked arms pushing or steering them off balance. It was these long guard tactics that led Ali to teasingly dub Foreman the Mummy. While long guard techniques left Foreman far more open than he would have been using a more traditional guard, Foreman was able to stay safe by being surprisingly agile for his size. When his opponents attempted to throw wide hooks around his outstretched arms, Foreman would deftly sidestep or duck away before resuming his steady march forward. This relentless, risky pressure style was perfectly in line with the image Foreman wanted to portray, and how he wanted to think of himself. Influenced in part by his rough childhood, and in greater part by his mentor and sparring partner, the terrifying ex-champion Sonny Liston, Foreman carefully cultivated the persona of an invincible juggernaut, cruel, uncaring, and mostly unstoppable. As Foreman climbed his way to the top of the heavyweight division, he picked up even more skills, adding wrestling techniques to control his opponents at close range and place them where he wanted them. I have it on good authority that most of these techniques were taught to Foreman by Archie Moore, the legendary cross-guard boxer with 132 knockouts. These new skills greatly helped Foreman in taking the heavyweight championship from Joe Frazier. Foreman moved the smaller man exactly where he wanted him for the duration of their short fight, winning the title in just 2 rounds. Another factor in Frazier's quick demise was a tactic that Foreman had used from the very start of his career. There were few better than Foreman at setting up power punches off of the jab. See how Foreman capitalizes on Frazier's preference to duck under his jab by following up with an uppercut. In this way, Foreman used the predictability of his opponent's head movement against them. Foreman's loose guard also meant his punches were especially hard to predict. He had a tendency to start many of his punches the same way and then change their trajectory midway to the target. What looked like a hook might actually be an uppercut, or a shot to the body may veer upwards to catch an opponent on the chin. These directional feints were something that seemed especially worrying to Ali. Nonetheless, after Foreman took out Ken Norton in only 2 rounds, a man that Ali had struggled against greatly, Ali was still ready and willing to fight Foreman. And Foreman, of course, thought little of the loudmouth ex-champion who lacked his size and power. The rumble in the jungle would become one of the most iconic moments in sports history. Ali used his speed to throw sharp crosses right through Foreman's open guard, and then out-grappled him against the ropes to tire him out. Foreman's wrestling worked to sap the strength of every other opponent he had ever gone up against, punishing them every time they threw a punch by throwing them widely off balance. But now Foreman came up against someone who not only used similar techniques, but did it better. Encouraged by Ali's endless taunting and his own coaches, Foreman threw everything he had at Ali until he had no more. The champion became so tired that in time he would come to wonder if he was drugged before the fight. Still, Foreman never doubted that he was only 1 punch away from shutting Ali up for good. But then, Ali capitalized on Foreman's exhaustion and sent him crashing to the canvas. With that 1 punch, Foreman lost everything that he had spent his life working for. For the first time, Foreman began to doubt himself and the careful persona he had tried so hard to cultivate. This was the beginning of Foreman's period of self-reflection, but at first, he would rebel. Trying to prove that he was still the man he'd always been, Foreman set up an exhibition where he took on 5 men in 1 night. His hope was to re-establish his persona as an unstoppable monster, forcing Ali to take a rematch. Foreman ended most of the fights via knockout, but what he hadn't counted on was that the public had not lost respect for him as he thought they had. Rather than see Foreman as a fearless warrior fighting against impossible odds, which anyone who has even lightly sparred fresh opponents one after the other knows he was, the crowd instead rooted for Foreman's challengers, seeing them as brave everymen going up against an unstoppable giant. Although Foreman made his point, the night had achieved the opposite of what he hoped it would. What did win people over was an insane slugfest with Ron Lyle. The Lyle fight proved that Foreman had what it took to move past adversity. Foreman got back from being knocked down again and again, standing toe-to-toe with a man almost as tough and powerful as he was. According to Foreman, at the time, he would rather have died than lose again. And although it cost him, he eventually prevailed. As time rolled on, Foreman convincingly put down challenger after challenger, It seemed that Ali would be forced to fight Foreman once again. That is, until the night that changed everything. Until the night that Foreman fought Jimmy Young. Early in the fight, Foreman had failed to press an advantage because the promoters had requested he make his fights last longer. But by the time Foreman wanted to end the fight, he no longer could. Like Ali, Young kept Foreman off his rhythm by flicking out a quick, loose jab, and then tied him up before he could fire off any shots of his own. Young went about this in a different way than Ali, sinking in deep underhooks to smother Foreman's punches. In the last round, Young sealed Foreman's fate by catching him with a right while he was off balance, forcing him to his knees, and scoring a timely knockdown at the very end of the fight. The judges unanimously called the fight for Young. The loss changed George Foreman forever, but this time, Foreman did not seek to reestablish his reputation. Instead, he embraced his loss. Foreman would soon explain to his friends that he had had a religious experience after the fight, that he had come close to death and had realized the fragility of life. Foreman took a hard look at what really mattered to him. He quit boxing immediately, eventually becoming a minister. After seeing the impact that his brother Roy was having teaching kids boxing, Foreman opened a youth center to help keep underprivileged kids out of trouble. But after someone he trusted stole a good portion of his money, something surprisingly common in the world of boxing and entertainment, Foreman realized he no longer had the funds necessary to keep helping his community. That was when Foreman made the fateful decision to return to boxing 10 years after he had lost his title to Ali. What's more, he vowed to once again become heavyweight champion of the world. As expected, very few thought that was possible. And it may not have been if Foreman hadn't gained the wisdom and maturity to take account of his remaining strengths and acknowledge his new weaknesses. Bringing back Archie Moore, Foreman became an apt pupil, mastering Moore's signature crossguard. Foreman used to control his opponent's jab by reaching out to stop it, catch it, or leverage guard, and this left openings that Ali and other fast boxers could take advantage of. Foreman's new crossguard took away these lead side openings. This meant that Foreman no longer needed to use footwork or head movement to evade his opponent's attacks. He would instead rely entirely on his size, his lead hand jabbing and repositioning his opponent, and his rear hand defending against jabs or lead hooks. At close range, Foreman no longer needed to sidestep and turn. He could instead move in close in a crossguard, and from there, he could either lean on those that tried to crouch, or use his forearm to lift their chins and straighten up their posture. Foreman could still manipulate their balance by cross-framing off of his crossguard, and this also provided a safe way to exit exchanges. With this new system, Foreman could control distance with very little effort. He would use his crossguard when he wanted to move in closer, and utilize his old long guard tactics when he wanted to create space or reposition his opponent. All this was backed up by an even deeper understanding of the jab than Foreman had before. Foreman now jabbed from all angles. Notice how he uses an up jab here on a crouching opponent. Here he uses a flicker jab to set up his right. And here Foreman pumps out two stiff jabs, meant to hurt his opponent towards the ring. A true mark of someone who understands their own style is that they know where their weaknesses lie. The crossguard leaves the fighter's body more open on the side of his high cross block, and his chin more open on the side of his low cross block. So notice how Foreman immediately takes advantage of this fact when his opponent tries to use a crossguard himself, catching him with a liver blow. This is why it's so exciting that Daniel Cormier, an MMA champion who uses a mix of long guard and cross guard himself, has gone to Foreman for boxing advice. While Foreman showed his opponents a great deal of mercy, calling refs over to stop the fight rather than wail on them as he had in the past, he also, at times, gave his opponents a taste of the near-death experience he had had after his bout with Young. As one of Foreman's competitors put it after quitting in the ring, "Man, I saw death. I wasn't going to die in that ring. That was death." Eventually, Foreman had racked up enough victories to challenge the current champion, Evander Holyfield, for his title. Many viewed the contest as a joke, the last gasp of a dying man. Foreman replied to all such criticism with the quick-witted humor he developed throughout his years preaching, and determined to let his fists do the talking the night of the fight. As it turned out, Foreman's fists still spoke loud and clear. The first few rounds were surprising to most, with Foreman evading Holyfield's jabs and snapping his head back with his own. Holyfield's attempts at power blows with little to no setup made for easy counters. But in round 3, it was Foreman who largely abandoned his jab, giving Holyfield the chance he needed to steal the round. He countered Foreman's uppercut with a tight hook, and then unloaded 15 consecutive punches. Perhaps it was this late round success that made Holyfield think it was a good idea to stand and throw right in front of Foreman. Foreman used this opportunity to take the punches on his guard and move into close range. Foreman's close-range body blows eventually took a heavy toll on Holyfield, whose work rate and footwork slowed drastically in the 5th. Foreman's body punches convinced Holyfield to lower his guard, and it seemed that Foreman simply couldn't miss with his right. At that point, Holyfield's corner understandably told him to move after he threw. Holyfield largely ignored this advice throughout the 6th, getting wobbled with a hook near the end of the round, and then chose to stand right in front of Foreman again in the 7th. We can be glad he did, because round 7 became one of the most exciting in boxing history. A Foreman overhand right crashed into Holyfield as he tried to cut an angle out of the corner, and Big George went on the offensive, picking his moments to skillfully arc his right over Holyfield's shoulder. Holyfield had a tendency to lead with his head, and as such had always found some measure of safety at close range. But Foreman's crossguard meant that Holyfield would simply bounce his head off of Foreman's elbow. Things looked great for Foreman, but then, all defensive options taken away, Holyfield did what so few of Big George's opponents had done before. He went on the offensive, throwing 20 punches in a row. Holyfield was taking advantage of the fact that Foreman couldn't counter well from his crossguard. As such, Big George was forced to adjust his guard as best he could until Holyfield stopped punching. And Holyfield wasn't stopping. Luckily for Foreman, the crossguard does a great job at catching punches halfway out, dispelling their force even if they do connect. Even throwing off an opponent's follow-through after they've already made contact can help take a lot of the sting off. Even so, enough punches hit clean that it was a small miracle Foreman was still standing at the end of Holyfield's barrage. After a brief respite, Foreman went right back on the attack, feeding Holyfield several of the same uppercuts that had finished Ron Lyle all those years ago. Now both men seemed too spent to do anything, and it was anyone's guess how the remainder of the fight might play out. In round 8, both men seemed content to take a break, Holyfield circling and jabbing and throwing sporadic two-punch combinations. Foreman simply marched forward, taking the brunt of the shots on his guard. However, in round 9, it was clear that Holyfield had recovered while Foreman had not. Holyfield scored 2 beautiful combinations which Foreman had no answer for, and Big George ended the round in deep trouble. But then, in round 10, Foreman surprised everyone one last time. A quick timeout mid-round to wrap Holyfield's glove gave Foreman an extra moment of respite, and Foreman put the spot of good luck to good use. He came out at a much faster pace, cutting off Holyfield's lateral movement with wide body hooks and goading him by dropping his hands. It worked, and Holyfield again stood toe-to-toe with Foreman. Both men landed, but in the end it seemed to be Holyfield who was most hurt, wincing and backing away. Big George knew a hurt fighter when he saw one, and landed a thudding 1-2 combination, forcing Holyfield to clinch. Too tired to follow up, Foreman would allow Holyfield to clinch for the remainder of the round, although he did land a final parting shot just at the bell. However, the last several rounds had given Holyfield an obvious lead in points, and it was clear to all watching that Foreman now needed a knockout to win. The 11th was much the same story, with Holyfield penetrating Foreman's guard with fast combinations, but eventually paying the price for standing too close to the fire. Midway through the round, Foreman countered Holyfield's right with a right of his own, landing what Holyfield would later describe as the hardest punch he'd ever been hit with. Returning to his corner, Holyfield had to ask if all of his teeth were still in, as his entire mouth had gone numb. The 12th was like a microcosm for the entirety of the fight. Holyfield outpointed Foreman by throwing quick flurries, adding on just enough punches to penetrate Foreman's crossguard once or twice before fading out of range or clinching. Foreman desperately tried for one last knockout blow, but Holyfield remembered the punch from the 11th and wasn't about to get knocked out the last round of the fight. He clinched so long that the ref had to forcibly push him off. As the clock wound down, Foreman landed the occasional bomb, but not the one punch he needed to put Holyfield on the ground. Finally, the final bell rang. Foreman had given his best, but after a tremendous fight, it was Holyfield that took the bout with a unanimous decision. Foreman lasting 12 rounds in a competitive fight with the champion of the world, a fight where he was on the edge of achieving victory several times, seemed to many to be an incredible last achievement of a highly skilled but aging fighter. Who could ask for more? Even if Foreman wanted to keep trying, when would another chance like this ever come up again? The world just didn't work that way. But then, astoundingly, Foreman did get one last chance. Holyfield lost to the undefeated southpaw, Michael Moorer, and Moorer was more than happy to fight Big George Foreman. Moorer viewed the fight as an easy win over a high-profile opponent, a tune-up fight that would still draw attention and add to his legacy. Foreman, now 45, had other ideas. The night of the fight, Foreman wore the same trunks that he had worn against Ali 20 years before. And as it turned out, Foreman would look far more the fighter he had been when he last wore those shorts. For instance, many were surprised to see that Foreman had completely abandoned his crossguard. Instead, he fought like the Foreman of old, pawing at his opponent's gloves and using long guard tactics to block and smother punches. There are a number of plausible reasons for why Foreman chose to do this, but perhaps the biggest was that Foreman wanted his hands to always be in position to counter, something near impossible in the way that he implemented the crossguard. The effects of Foreman's style change were apparent immediately. An obvious con was that Foreman was much more open, and as a result, a lot more shots got through his defenses than normally did. This was confounded by the fact that, in an open stance, where fighters have opposite feet forward, it's much easier to connect with your rear hand. The upside was that Foreman's right was finding a home as well. But the strange thing was that Big George's punches didn't seem to have the same effect on Moorer that they'd had on Holyfield, a man with a much better chin. To many watching, it must have seemed that age had finally caught up with George Foreman. Moorer's corner, Teddy Atlas, seemed to think this was the case. Atlas gave Moorer two pieces of advice. The first was to mix up his range. Excellent advice. The second was to relax, as he now had the full measure of Big George. But, as it turned out, Foreman's lackluster punches were all part of his plan. Over the next several rounds, Foreman's power remained bizarrely absent, but as he got into a rhythm, his boxing skills seemed to return better than ever. Like many orthodox fighters, Foreman could have been expected to do worse against a southpaw. Instead, the lead hand battle that comes inherently to the position fit Foreman's style perfectly. Moorer's head and shoulder were closer to Foreman's lead hand, making it even easier to manipulate his guard and knock him off balance. Moorer liked to sidestep and slip off his jab to set up a new angle for his next punch. But Foreman now used the extension of his own jab to help Moorer along, unbalancing him and moving him directly into his punches. The open stance position did mean that Foreman's rear hand was now usually too far away to effectively stifle Moorer's. However, Foreman could cross-frame with his rear hand on Moorer's lead shoulder, and this effectively shielded him from both hands as he exited safely outside. Besides, Foreman wasn't looking to be defensive, he was looking to counter. Although Foreman was a slower man, his years of experience helped him to better read punches, and he intercepted several of Moorer's rights with his own before Moorer even had the chance to extend them. These tactics, combined with a heavy dose of return jabs, ensured that even though Moorer might get off more punches, he would pay some kind of price for each of them. Building on his success over the last several rounds, Foreman began to pull down Moorer's lead hand to make way for his right. But despite Foreman's power punches getting through, Moorer maintained a comfortable lead on the scorecard, and seemed perfectly happy to trade with Big George. By the end of the fifth, Teddy Atlas had begun to sense something might be up, and implored Moorer to fight more cautiously, asking him to get his shots off first, and then immediately move out of range. Moorer ignored him. After Foreman tricked Moorer into ducking or slipping into several right hands set up off his jab, Moorer seemed to lose his cool. He decided to stand and slug it out with Foreman. Foreman took Moorer's punches and landed several of his own. To all watching, it now seemed certain that Foreman had lost his legendary fight-ending power. Then again, Moorer found himself inexplicably stumbling over his own feet the last few seconds of the round. In the 7th, Foreman switched things up by circling inside, the opposite of what traditional wisdom says to do against a southpaw. Because both fighters stood squared up at mid-range throughout the fight, foot position had mattered less than it generally would. But what did matter was the statement that Foreman was making. When Moorer moved inside, he was betting Foreman that he could still beat him with his superior speed. When Foreman moved inside, he was saying he didn't care. Although Moorer got the better of several exchanges, he also took a great deal of hard punches that he either didn't see or simply didn't care to defend. By the end of the round, Moorer's work rate had slowed considerably, and even though he had landed more punches, he was backing away. Moorer himself might not have understood why his body wouldn't do what he wanted it to do, but George Foreman certainly did. The 8th started out well for Foreman, the bigger man landing several right hands. This prompted Moorer to finally follow the advice that Atlas had been giving him about upping his pace. Late in the round, the champion found an opening and piled on, unloading on Foreman until the bell granted him a brief respite. Moorer continued his assault into the 9th. Foreman's tight, snappy rights kept making their way through Moorer's guard, but were barely noticed by both the audience and, oddly enough, by Moorer himself. It now seemed a certainty that this would be a repeat of the Holyfield fight, with the aging ex-champion coming close, but falling just short in the end. And worse, it seemed that Big George had lost the power that had given him a puncher's chance in the later rounds. In his corner, the great coach Angelo Dundee pleaded with Foreman to take charge, telling him that they were way behind. Essentially, it was now or never. And that was when Foreman showed the world the trick he had been playing all along. Foreman came out twice the man he had been the round before, his punches twice as fast, hitting twice as hard. For the first time, Moorer got a taste of something close to Foreman's real power. Now Moorer's head didn't just snap back, he was knocked completely off balance. Foreman only upped the pace, swinging wide looping hooks that stunned Moorer through his guard, and mixing in the same short, tight crosses that he had throughout the fight. The difference was that now they had weight behind them. Moorer backed up, no doubt just as confused as the spectators. The truth was, Foreman had been baiting Moorer the entire time. When Foreman had learned that there was no 3 knockdown stoppage rule, he had determined he could not show his full power right away. The last thing he wanted was to have Moorer survive several knockdowns and then use fancy footwork from long range to outpoint him the remainder of the fight. Instead, Foreman tricked Moorer into thinking he had what it took to go toe-to-toe with him, putting just enough power on his punches to hurt, but not enough to scare Moorer into taking a more cautious approach. If Moorer had suspected what Foreman really had left, he no doubt wouldn't have allowed himself to take so much damage. But now, Moorer's apparent prey had reversed course, barred his fangs, and charged at him full speed. With a minute left in the round, Foreman again caught Moorer with another tight cross. Stunned, Moorer backed up. Now was Foreman's chance. To quote the big man himself, "I threw a sharp left jab, then a strong right that caught him on the forehead and made my hand hurt. Not wanting to wail on him until he fell, I decided to bring the shot a little lower." Foreman's second cross perfectly turned Moorer's chin, and the champion of the world crumbled to the canvas, felled not by this one blow, but by the countless ones just like it over the last 10 rounds. 20 years after Ali had outsmarted Foreman to take his belt back, Foreman outsmarted Moorer to take his belt back. Foreman had used Moorer's pride against him, just as Ali had done to Foreman all those years ago. Big George stood in disbelief as the ref counted Moorer out, then fell to the canvas and prayed. His life had come full circle. Foreman's victory was the last echo of the greatest era in heavyweight boxing, a final triumph from one of the three extraordinary men who helped define a generation. One last time, Big George Foreman had shook up the world. This concludes the Golden Age of Heavyweight Saga. This has been David Christian from The Modern Martial Artist, wishing you, as always, happy training.